So, why did you decide you want to get into this position?
Into the safety of schools?
Mm-hmm.
Well, when I was with the police department, one of the things I did back in 1988 was I started the DARE program in Overland Park.
Okay.
And it was, at the time, it was a pretty close to being a pretty brand new program. It came out of Los Angeles.
I remember.
Yeah. And I was pretty passionate about that. I did it for 2 years. I was pretty fired up about the idea of helping to instill some good ideas in kids' minds that might help them to resist drug abuse. So I really enjoyed that. And then later in my career, when the opportunity arose, I became a supervisor over the school resource officer program.
Okay.
So I worked up in Shawnee Mission primarily, supervising that group, and then eventually moved to Blue Valley. So I had sort of at least a portion of my background in policing had to do with protecting students, being involved in that sort of work, and I really liked it. It just seemed like a good thing, it seemed like a good way to spend your time, a good way to spend your efforts and your energy and your talent trying to make schools safer.
So you were already basically managing the officers for the schools.
Yeah.
Just now or at that time you were with the police department.
Right.
Instead of being employed by.
That's right. So I had the school resource officers that were provided by the city. Now I'm on this side, and I have the campus police officers, but we work so closely with the police department.
Sure.
I mean, it's just a partnership, a total partnership.
So you basically didn't really leave the police department.
Some days it feels like that. I have so much interaction with police officers. Today I had a lunch meeting with two captains from the police department. It's just every day there's some interaction for some reason.
Sure.
And I do like it because I had such a good relationships with the people I worked with that it was sort of nice leaving and not leaving. At the same time. It was kind of the best of both worlds.
So I have to ask the big question: Are our students safe in our schools?
Yes, they are. Unfortunately, the narrative that's sort of out there all the time, because of these individual events around the country, these acts of violence, the narrative becomes that schools are not safe. Mm-hmm. That it's just an inevitability that there will be a act of violence or a school shooting at your school, and that just simply isn't true. The statistics don't bear that out. But it's hard to overcome, even if you have one incident like Sandy Hook, it's hard to overcome that narrative because it's so traumatizing.
Right.
What occurred there is so traumatizing, and I get it, and I understand that we don't say, well, look, the stats say that it's very unlikely that anything will ever happen, so let's not worry about that. You can't do that either, right? That. But just statistically speaking, kids are safer in school than they are in your own home, as far as hazards to them are concerned.
Sure.
And then also, I think it's important, and I always like to do, if I ever talk to a parent group or a community group about this problem, I think it's a good place to start to get some perspective on what exactly, or what's the scope of the problem first before you dig in and dive into how we're going to solve it. And it helps to get a little perspective. You don't want to approach this thing, at least not completely, from an emotional place. You want to try to come at it from a rational and intellectual place. So if I said to you, for example, that your chances of being struck by lightning, if you Google this question, this year are, I think it's somewhere, it varies depending on what site you end up on, but somewhere in the ballpark of 1 in 900,000, something like that. Whereas the chances of being the victim of a school shooting are much, much lower than that. I mean, significantly lower than that. So I think if I asked you, do you think you're going to get struck by lightning this year? You're going to say, well, absolutely not.
Right.
And not only that, but you're going to do things probably as a reasonable human being to minimize your chances of being struck by lightning, right?
Right.
So we don't say in our schools that, hey, the chances of being struck by lightning are 1 in 960,000. So if there's a storm, just leave the kids outside because
Sure.
the odds are so low.
Right.
You further reduce those risks by saying, hey, if we hear thunder, our kids are inside.
Sure.
So you further reduce the risk by putting in those extra layers of security. And really the same thing goes for these horrific incidents that happen in schools. We know that the chances of a student or a staff member being a victim of a school shooting are infinitesimally low. But then we've put more layers of security in to hopefully further minimize or reduce that risk. But we never say we've eliminated the risk.
Sure.
Because that would be disingenuous and wouldn't, you can't do it.
No.
You can't completely eliminate the risk, but you can, build in layers of security and try to minimize, right?
So the way those statistics are discovered or created is they just basically look at how many schools we have in the country, and then they take the number of instances, and then they just figure it out from there.
Well, I mean, the way I did it was I went back and looked at every incident of school shooting since 1990. I wanted to just, I mean, I could go back as far as we want to go back, but I just thought, well, 90 is a fair starting point.
Yeah.
That's 28 years of data. And I looked at each one individually, just did this research, and then eliminated the ones that occurred in universities and colleges, because all I really was interested in is K-12, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and then really tried to lay out those numbers in a fair, unbiased way. I feel like a lot of times, if you watch the news, that the information will be presented in a way that's that tends more to be provocative.
Yeah.
And isn't fully explained. So I remember earlier this year hearing this stat. I kept hearing it over and over on the news about there's already been 18 school shootings this year, something like that. It was like February or something. Well, what they didn't tell you was it included in that number is suicide, robbery anywhere on the premises, drug deals that went bad on the premises, could be at midnight. Something happens
So
on
this
the
could
campus.
include not even when school's in session.
Right, exactly. And so but that's not, when you hear that phrase school shooting, you're not thinking of those things.
No.
You're thinking of mass murder.
You're
somebody
thinking of
that's trying to
school
kill
in
as
session.
many
Right.
students as possible.
All those
and
kids in school.
Yeah, those sorts of shootings are few and far between. They're just very, very rare. And then the other kind of, if you hear school shooting, I assume you'd think the same way. I always, if I heard that phrase, I would think it's somebody that's trying to kill kids. But over half of school shootings, staff are the ones who are targeted.
By the
kids.
kid?
Not kids.
By the
In
student?
many cases, yes, most cases. But yeah, it's just helpful. It doesn't necessarily make things better. It's just helpful to really understand the problem and not just listen to sensationalism. Really get at what is the problem. Because to me, if you don't understand that, then your solutions are probably going to have errors in them.
Sure.
I would think the things you come up with, or you might buy something that you don't need. Or you might put a
Right,
protocol in
right.
place that's completely unnecessary or a
Right.
waste of time or whatever it might be. And things that don't work, et cetera. So I think it's just really good to get a good perspective, and then when you see you kind of understand the nature of the problem, then start, like I said, layering in security that addresses that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So did you figure out the statistic?
The statistic of
The likelihood of my child in school getting into a situation where somebody comes in with a gun.
that actually would shoot them.
Yeah.
It's like I have to go back. I have to go back and look at the exact statistic, but it's somewhere in the ballpark of let me remember. It's one. I think it's 1 in 7 million I think, of a person being the victim, staff or student, of a shooting in a K-12 environment.
Wow.
And it goes even lower than that when you start talking about an elementary school, which, of course, Sandy Hook, had everybody on the edge of their seat because of what had happened there. It was so horrific. But the focus started turning towards elementary schools. And a lot of the rhetoric that was being put out there suggested that suddenly elementary schools were going to be the victim of this evolutionary trend that really didn't exist. It was sort of an anomaly.
So basically, people should just, we're not saying to not watch the media, but kind of do some fact checking as well. Mm-hmm. You don't have to just give up the news, but if you see something, then you go, I want to Google that, and then really look at the true numbers and the statistics before I make a decision on how I feel about it.
Yeah, I think it's important to, it's important to have an appreciation for what's really going on. What does the data tell you?
Sure.
I think you're just more apt to make better, reasonable decisions, and maybe what I like to think is that a lot of people, it will lower their anxiety a little bit about where they are on this issue. Because, I've talked to a lot of parents, as you can imagine, parents, especially on the heels of any nationally televised or national attention type school shooting, and there are parents who call that are really truly scared. And
I can understand that.
And I remember a parent saying to me that every day when she drops off her daughter at school, she's afraid she won't ever see her again. And that's not a good way to drop your child off at school. And shouldn't be. It shouldn't be the way you see it. Like I said, I gave you the example of lightning, but there's hundreds of other things you could compare this
car
to,
crash.
and you wouldn't worry about it.
Right. We get in our car every single day.
Yeah, the chances of a student being injured in a car accident on the way to or from school is, again, it's just hugely more possible.
More likely to happen
than something happening in the school.
Especially if they just got their license.
Yeah, that should be a concern.
So after all of this media attention with, or the events happening in our country recently, what has that caused Blue Valley to do in a reaction?
Well, what's great, what makes me feel really good is even before I came to Blue Valley had a director of safety and security that had worked with the Secret Service. And he had brought a lot of the things that he had learned in the Secret Service to Blue Valley, which was really a blessing to the school district because because it's so easy people in this arena to identify themselves as experts, right? If they've been in law enforcement, there's people who might consider themselves an expert automatically in school safety. That's not necessarily the case. Or someone who, I don't know. There's probably lots of examples. Someone who's in security, but school safety and security is sort of an interesting and unique situation. Lots and lots of young people in a small space. But what was nice was that the Secret Service. At first you might say, well, what's the Secret Service got to do with schools? But the Secret Service, their primary job. Their secondary jobs are investigating financial crimes and things like that, but their primary job is to protect elected officials, right? Mm-hmm. And so they're very, very good at reacting if there's an attack, and they had stressed that, and it was very important to them, as Dennis explained to me. Dennis McCarthy was the fellow's name, who was the director of safety security, but what they really wanted to look at was how can we prevent these things from happening. And so they did a study many, many years ago looking at assassins and what's the profile. What are some things we can learn about assassins that might help us to identify them before they do what they maybe are set out to do. And they came up with this strategy of identifying, assessing, and managing, which basically is identifying a person who's on a path to violence, then assessing that person, and then managing that person. Okay, now that's pretty broad. It can take a lot of different forms, but he basically brought that strategy to Blue Valley. So if we have a student who's on a path to violence, let's identify that person first, and
Sure.
then we'll assess, and then we'll manage. And so same strategy, which we have continued to this day. The idea being that students who are on that path to violence are going to exhibit certain behaviors that hopefully will raise red flags and cause teachers, counselors, custodians, cafeteria, whoever it might be, to say, hey, there's something wrong here, and then bring that to the attention of an administrator, and then the process starts to unfold. Of course,
They're kind of doing the same approach with the unfortunate high suicide rate with students, and kind of keeping their ears and eyes open and seeing those signs that could be leading to that extremely unfortunate
Yes.
incidents.
right.
So, with the things that's Blue Valley is doing now, so what are they after the whole? Other than so you had the procedures. Are there any things like, I don't know, surveillance, or maybe locking the doors more, or I don't know, having reinforced doors or something? I think I've seen before in other areas where they have like the thing where you can put on the. Have you seen that? You like lock up the
Yeah.
door
Yeah.
so they can't get in.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and the reason I brought up the identify, assess, and manage strategy first is because it's all rooted in trusted adult relationships with kids, and it is the cornerstone of our violence prevention strategy. Okay, and I always like to talk about that first because I think it is the most important part of what we do. A lot of times, if you're watching the news and there's a school district out there that has some new safety and security measure they're putting in place, a lot of times, most of the time, it's something physical, like the kinds of things you were mentioning. It's some
Yeah.
physical thing. And oftentimes, it's a physical thing that's meant to keep intruders out of a building.
Correct.
Right? But the FBI says that 95% of school shooters are already in the building, and they're students most of the time.
95%.
95% now that's a stat that's a little bit old, so that's probably adjusted back and forth a few times.
Okay.
But it's let's even say 90%. So the vast majority are already in the building, and sometimes the way I describe it is either they're a student or a recently suspended or expelled student. Okay, so they're part of the student body. They're someone who's going to look like they belong there. And so if that's the case, then all this work at keeping intruders out, while it may be important, is probably not the first thing on the list. The first thing on the list should be turning your attention towards those students that are already in the building and making sure that you have a trusted adult relationships established with every student in the building, that we don't have a scenario where something bad happens and then afterwards people say things like, gosh, we never knew that student. No one ever knew him. He was a loner. No one talked to him. He just sort of walked around the building and ignored everybody, or whatever it might be. We just won't tolerate that.
Right.
We say that every student has to have an adult that they can turn to if something's bothering them, or if they're seeing something that's concerning.
Sure.
And they're seeing it on social media typically,
Right.
or even if they're seeing something a student is writing or talking about or whatever it might be. So that's why we put such a great emphasis on that and try to build that culture in Blue Valley, because I'm convinced that is what can prevent these things from happening. I think that's what can stop school violence in its tracks.
Preventing it and taking action before it actually happens.
Yeah, and there have been, in my time with Blue Valley and Dennis's time in Blue Valley, we can share anecdotal stories about how information comes to us via a relationship a student
Sure.
might have with a teacher, counselor. It could be anybody in the building, but that information gets to an adult and then on to where it needs to go to keep something bad from happening. And we all have, from Blue Valley, have those anecdotal stories. But, the Secret Service did a study after this study I mentioned earlier with assassins. They did a study about school shooters. They were asked to do it probably because of the previous study they did. And one of the things they discovered when they studied the school shootings that had happened after Columbine was that students who perpetrated these, or young people who perpetrated these acts, almost always told someone else about it ahead of time, another peer. But the information never made it to an adult.
So maybe promoting more sharing of that knowledge from the other students and the peers who are seeing it on Instagram.
Opening up the
Facebook.
lines of communication so that students feel comfortable. They may not come to the principal
Right.
necessarily, but they might go to
Their teacher.
the shop teacher
Sure.
who they've always had a good rapport with. And again, that's where we have these anecdotal stories that support that from happening. But then we also recognize, this is something we're just doing recently, we recognize that even if we have a good solid culture like that, which I believe we do, there may be a gap there where we have instances where students may still be just too concerned to bring information forward. Maybe they're concerned that somehow it'll get back, that they were the person who told, it might damage a friendship. They'd rather just stay out of it. So we recently kind of partnered up with a TIPS hotline, people in Kansas City, Missouri, that everybody's pretty familiar with in the metro area, and they've developed a TIPS app for teens. And it's an app on their phone, because we know that teens really don't like to make phone calls.
No.
Right? They do stuff with apps and
Sure.
text and that sort of. So this TIPS app for teens, we're encouraging all of our high school students to load onto their phone, and then they can send anonymous tips in, any time if they want to just kind of keep their own name out of the
Sure.
mix. And those tips, the second they hit send, go to a live operator at the TIPS hotline. And then that operator assesses what the tip is and comes right back to us or the police department, depending on the nature of the tip, and it's addressed immediately. So that's also a great tool. Now, moving beyond the prevention piece of this, we do take very seriously the idea that someone from the outside, someone who's mentally ill or
Yep.
someone who's psychopathic,
Yep.
or maybe somebody who's just angry or could come to the school, and we don't want to just allow open access to our buildings because of events that have happened, in our country. So several years ago, we developed what we called pinch point entrances, to where people coming in the building had to come through one door, couldn't get any farther into the building before they had to go into the office and check in as a visitor. And we also gave our folks in the office the ability to lock the door remotely if they saw something that they were concerned about. As we've moved along in time, I think there's been a feeling that we can do even better than that. Mm-hmm. And so we just recently installed, or I'm sorry, I just got ahead of myself. We are in the process of installing what people generally refer to as a buzzer system or secure access system. In other words, we have to walk up and ring a doorbell before any door gets unlocked. And the bell activates a visual video screen for one of the administrative assistants in the office to take
So
a
be
good
a
look at
camera.
you.
Yeah.
Camera, and you have to show your government ID and explain why you're there.
This will be standard with all Blue Valley schools.
It will be, yes. Now, I wish I had a timeline to say when we're going to get this work done, but it's anytime we do anything in Blue Valley, it's like times 38, and it just takes time to.
I think that's a government standard.
Yeah, it's all these different buildings, and every building's a little bit different than the other one, and so there's some complications to getting it all done. But we're hoping that the electrical components of all that have already begun or in progress, and then we hope to start putting the systems in maybe as early as next week, if everything comes together
Sure.
the way we hope it does.
Why not metal detectors in all the schools?
Yeah, we get asked about metal detectors a lot. and usually it's in this context of, well, they have metal detectors at the airport, so, and that's how they keep weapons off the airplane, so why in the world would we have them at schools? It's a legitimate question.
Sure.
And I think it's a good question. And the answer, as far as we're concerned, is that the airport is different than a school, right? In the airport, they do not have some of these opportunities I was talking about earlier. They're not going to be able to, in an airport, in the short time that you're passing through security, develop trusted adult relationships,
right,
to develop this network of communication, to these sorts of things. It's a different. You're dealing with apples and oranges here.
Sure.
Okay. Now I understand we're also dealing with human lives, and we take that very seriously. But metal detectors sort of fly in the face of what we're trying to do when it comes to prevention, right? So, how do you convince your student population that we're a family, we're in this together? We need your help. If something's wrong, we want you to come to us. You can trust us and talk to us. If you see something that's concerning, we want you to come and talk to us. How do you develop that kind of familial environment? But every day a student comes to school, has to pass 3 or 4 uniformed police officers, security guards, put all their stuff up on a conveyor belt, run it through a metal detector. They have to walk through a metal detector. Maybe they have to have a wand passed over them.
Right.
This is part of management, right? And they have to go through all of that before. That's the first thing they experience at the beginning of each day as they come into a building. I think it'd be pretty difficult then to, as soon as they're done with that, to sort of say, okay, now we're back on the same team again. It's just a difficult proposition. I know it has to be done in some places.
Sure.
There are places in probably in Kansas City where they've run out of options. There's just maybe there's guns. They're so prolific, and it's become a problem. And I don't pretend to pass any judgment on any school that feels like they need that as that other layer of security. We're just not there, and I hope we never get there.
Right.
Because I think we'll really struggle to have that culture that I'm talking about. Trust. Right. Yeah, if we do that. Now, there's also been some studies that show that metal detectors just don't make that big a difference. Some kids who never would have brought a gun to school to begin with see the metal detector as a challenge.
Right, I was just thinking that.
And they'll find ways to get guns into schools.
It's like now with all this coding, like now they just want to hack into everything.
Yeah, and they're brilliant. I know. These kids are brilliant.
They can figure it out.
The stuff they come up with. So, yeah, we hope we never have to. It would be a pretty negative impact on the culture. Yeah. So far, no on that one.
Yeah. I can completely understand that. It's like one of those things where you tell your kids, "I trust you," but then you lock everything up, and you're like, "Let me see your phone," and then you track them on GPS, and you do all these things, but I still trust you.
Yeah.
So I completely understand that. Shifting gears here, so we had an unfortunate incident that just happened recently with was it a construction worker or a playground worker over at Sunrise Point?
Yeah.
What happened there?
There was some kind of dispute between these workers who were there. They were there as a contract company that was there to do some turf work on the playground, and there was some kind of argument. I don't know what it was about.
Sure.
But it resulted in a shooting there on the playground. And 2 people were initially injured. One of them passed away.
Wow.
I understand. Yeah.
And then he took off on foot?
Yeah. No, I think the suspect drove away from the scene.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then he ended up going to a car wash?
Yeah. He the way I understand it is he ended up being involved in a carjacking. Took a person's car.
Yeah.
And then drove back to the residence where that car belonged. And then the police were able to apprehend him there.
So when he did the carjacking, did the owner of the car stay in the car?
No.
they got out.
Yeah.
That's smart.
That's my understanding.
How did they know where they lived?
Well, you think about what you might have in your car that
Right.
would tell somebody if they. I don't know. I don't know how he figured it out.
A
I don't
wallet?
know if a purse was left, a wallet. I honestly don't know. But I was processing it the same way you are.
Yeah.
How would you know? And if you looked in a glove box, maybe it would have an insurance card with your address on it. I don't know.
Registration.
And I don't know the answer to that. But
So that was a smart move, though, getting out of the car and saying, just take it.
yeah, and I don't even know what the circumstances of that were.
Right.
So yeah, I haven't read the reports on it, but I just know that the suspect ended up with this fellow's car and the same stuff that was on the news.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that was pretty shocking because in our area, it's pretty unlikely that will happen.
Yeah, it's one of the strangest things that I've seen
Yeah.
ever happen. I hope it never happens again. It was, just thank goodness it was during the summer. No kids
Right.
were around, and it was just a terrible, terrible thing.
So I wasn't around or near the area, but was it like tons of police cars came in and swooped in as soon as that happened?
Yeah, there was a good number. Overland Park, they just do a great job when it comes to responding to those types of incidents. They're, very, very conscientious, and they bring everything that's needed to deal with it. And that, obviously the result was they caught
Sure.
him. So, but yeah, they typically come in on a situation like that, set up a perimeter and protect the crime scene and start getting as much information as they can. They did a great job.
Our police force in Overland Park is pretty.
Yeah, they're outstanding.
Yeah.
Yeah, Leawood, Olathe. We're really blessed in Johnson County to have such great law enforcement. Very responsive. And what I think one of the things I always really appreciate about them is they take time to understand situations, and don't just jump to conclusions about
Sure.
things. They take a lot of time to understand, even on a simple traffic stop. They want to hear what you have to say. I think a lot of people probably they get pulled over, they're resigned, they hold the license out the window, but they really want to hear what you have to say about it.
Sure.
And they want to listen and try to process and think, what's the best answer here? And I've always thought, I worked for Overland Park, so that's what I really can speak to, but I've always thought that the vast majority of officers do a nice job with that. And it helps to instill confidence, I think, in the public, even if they get in trouble,
Sure.
So even if you get in trouble, you feel like you were treated fairly and respectfully and compassionately, because everybody that I pulled over, I knew that could be my mom, my dad, my brother, grandmother.
Right.
And so
It's just another human being.
that's right. It's another human being who made a mistake in all probability, and the same mistake that I could make and probably did make.
Right. Right.
So
One of the conversations we had in the past was about something that I'm always kind of thinking about is home burglary. Somebody, breaking into your house. And one of the things I think I remember you telling me was it's more likely that they'll come in during the day
yes.
rather than the night. 'Cause
Right.
my fear, sleeping, got the kids and the wife in the house, they break in and intrude my house and then try to, steal some things or whatnot, or worse.
If-
That's not as likely as during the day.
It isn't. I had I was in charge of the kind of the burglary theft unit of the crimes against property investigative arm in Overland Park for about 7 years. So I read every single residential burglary that occurred for 7 years in Overland Park. Unless I was on vacation, I might have missed one. But otherwise, pretty much I read every single one.
Wow.
The vast majority of them occurred during the day. If you watch television, burglaries always occur at night.
Right.
Because it's a lot more interesting to have the burglar sneak up at night and scare everybody. But they happen during the day. When they happen at night, oftentimes it's because the burglar or burglars don't realize someone's home.
Sure.
And so they believe that the house is empty of people and break in. So
they don't want to deal with any people.
no,
They just
by and
wanna
large, burglars do not want to deal with people. That's the last thing on their mind is to deal with people. Now, if you have someone who is an armed robber who is interested in robbing people, it's not a smart way to go in a home, in a home invasion. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but people don't always make sense. They're on drugs or whatever it is. But I would say that, the chances of having an aggravated burglary, which is what it would be if someone's home, when they break in is few and far between. It's generally going to happen during the day, and that makes sense because people are at work during the day.
Right. They usually go through the front door?
Yes.
So I was shocked with that, but I guess during the day, if somebody sees you trying to break in or going in the back of a house compared to the front, it's not as suspicious if you're going in the front.
Yeah, it's pretty. It could look pretty normal if someone came up to a front door and rang the doorbell and nobody answered, and then they pried the door open, and they could walk in, push the door shut. It would look like just like it looked a few minutes before that.
Sure. I got one of those Nest doorbells. Has a little camera in front.
Mm-hmm. So it alerts you when someone comes up to the front door. Yeah.
And it records video.
Yeah.
So, what do you think of those?
I think that's great. Yeah, that's great.
So, what are the best steps to take to prevent or to make it harder for somebody to?
Oh gosh, there's so many things that are good to do to kind of safeguard your home. But I think one of the things we used to talk about was to walk around your house. It's not to say that a burglar can't enter the house some other way. They do sometimes. But walk around your house like you're a burglar, first of all, your own house.
Yeah.
And you play the part of the burglar and think about how you might be able to get into the home and then kind of shore those things up. So, and if you're in the habit of leaving things unlocked, you don't want to do that because it's a path of least resistance in many cases. The same way with auto burglaries. If you park your car in the street, it's less safe than if you park it in your driveway. It's further away from the house, less chance for being seen if someone's trying to get in your car. And then if you leave it unlocked, your car unlocked, then your chances go up of having your car burglarized as well. If you leave stuff out in the open in your car that looks valuable, you're up in the risk. So the house would be the same way. If you can make it tougher to get in, and you can make it noisy to get in, and you can light up the area, if someone decides to come in at night when you're on vacation, all those things are good because they attract attention, and they make it take longer for someone to get in. They make it noisier, and that's the chance for someone to see you and
makes sense.
And stop. So yeah. So there's a great product out there called the Jam Brace. That I think it has to be professionally installed pretty much, unless you just happen to be good at that kind of stuff. But that with a really good deadbolt in a front door is generally enough to keep someone from forcing your door open. Really strong stuff. Now, if you have a side light window, and someone can just pop that out and reach in and unlock your door.
I didn't think about that.
Yeah, so if you have side light windows, then you probably want to put laminated glass in those to further protect that entryway. But yeah, I would always start with the front door.
Okay.
That's where I'd start.
What's laminated? What do you mean laminated glass?
Well, I'm not going to get too technical because I can't.
Sure.
But laminated glass is generally I think two pieces of tempered glass that have a, I'm going to get this wrong. It's polycarbonate or poly something. It's there's flexible, almost like a plastic type polymer, I think it's called.
Sure.
I'm terrible with this stuff.
Right.
I just know.
I don't think most
I know
people
when I look at
either
it.
way.
Yeah, but it goes in between the two pieces of glass. It's all fused together, so when you look through it, it just looks like a pane of glass. But if you try to break through it, it's just nearly impossible. It takes forever to get through it. You have to really be determined to get through it, and it's been there's different levels. There's it's probably laminated glass is a pretty big industry, I'm sure, right now. But
Sure.
But anyway, it's hard to get through. You'd have to beat on it with a hammer for 5 minutes, and no one's going to do that. So if you can put that in as your side light glass, at least the one side where someone could reach around and open the door.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, you could lower the risk of someone getting in your house that way.
Awesome. So, any last remarks for any parents who still, or they're just asking you about this whole school safety thing, and what would you say to them to kind of help them with their anxiety?
Well, in Blue Valley, we have a safety and security department, and we think about this all the time. This is what we do. I mean, again, 8 hours a day, this is what we think about.
Sure.
Crisis, emergency management for the district. And so that, of course, doesn't just involve school shootings, although when people talk about school safety, that's the first thing they go to is school shootings. But that's the least likely thing to happen. There's a whole array of other things that can go wrong, other bad things that can happen that we have to address as well. But the point is that we have a whole department of people that's all they do is all day long is think about the safety of students.
Sure.
Yeah, and what we can do. And we're always looking at it. We're always trying to improve it. We don't reach a point where we say, hey, we're good. We've done everything we can. We're fine. Move on.
That's good.
We actually have formed we decided to go ahead and form a safety, a task force that worked till now. We're going to have a committee, I think, that's just going to meet, and there'll be people outside of our department that'll be on that committee to meet quarterly to just look at the things we're doing, the progress we're making, and where we might need to go as we move forward. Because times change, strategies change,
Yeah.
So we'll probably continue to do that as well. I know that recently we, just as an example of something, I mentioned earlier that we have an SRO and a campus officer in every high school. Well, we also have an SRO half-time in every middle school. So each SRO splits 2 middle schools.
Okay.
But we talked to the police department about this and our board and decided to ramp that up to full-time middle school resource officers.
Okay.
Now, that comes with a caveat. I say that, and we're budgeted to do that, and the police department's budgeted to do it, but it also means they have to staff it.
Sure.
And police department staffing has been quite a challenge in the last few years. So that's where we're headed. Eventually we'd like to have a full-time police officer in every middle school. I think with Overland Park's current staffing, that's a real challenge. So we may not see that at the beginning of the school year, but I'm hoping as time goes by, we'll eventually reach that point. And so that's another strong layer.
Sure.
To have a uniformed officer in every high school and middle school.
Maybe just looking at the statistics and the data, and then inputting that to base your decision off of, rather than just what you're seeing on the media or what people are telling you.
That's right.
Just look at the facts.
Yeah, look at the facts. Right. That's right.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, very good.
I greatly appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, enjoyed it.